Thanks everyone for tuning in to check out our podcast today, Maker Connect. My name is Matt Despins, and I'll be your host for the show. With me today, we have David Mitchell. David is currently Chief Revenue Officer at iCapture, and no doubt has some interesting thoughts and perspectives to share. David, if you're okay with it, let's start by hearing just a little bit about your career and kind of when you realized that negotiations were so important. So, David, it is the host here who's asking you to brag. So feel free to talk anything that you want to, and your humility is going to remain intact because I'm the one asking. So with that, I will turn it over to you, sir, to hear a little bit more about you.
Awesome. Thanks, Matt. I appreciate that. And the permission to have some humble brag time is always welcome, right?
In matter of fact, it's a request, not permission. I would like you to brag.
All right, deal. Sure. So I am a serial entrepreneur. I come from kind of a family of entrepreneurial-minded people. My dad is very entrepreneurial-minded, and so for me, the first business that I started really successfully was a window washing company.
Okay.
Started in Phoenix, Arizona, perfect place to have a window washing company.
Yep.
And I really, that was when I learned the value of turning down business or saying no, and how that can be valuable in negotiation. And that's actually something I'm teaching my son right now. And that was the first company that I experienced success in. I had tried other things prior to that. That was my first success. I was able to exit with, some grace and some dignity and enough quality, relationships to feel confident in my next adventure. And my adventures have ranged from small scale hydroponic farming, growing gourmet produce and selling directly to restaurants, grocers, catering companies here in Boise, Idaho, to working in software. And so negotiation and, it was, I think, probably my very first sales job. Actually, before I started my first company, I was in a direct sales role back in Illinois in about 2006, 2007. And I really learned the value of human psychology and how it relates to negotiation. And so I think that's when I fell in love with not just sales, but from my perspective, more the science of human psychology. And so, as I have gone through my adventures and tried a few different things and ultimately fell in love with automation, fell in love with software, and that's what I'm really passionate about now. Negotiating and the psychology of it has always kind of been kind of that core principle for me.
Where do you think that comes from? Let's actually, before you answer that question, did I hear correctly that you're in Boise, Idaho?
Yep, Boise, Idaho.
How long have you been there for?
Oh boy. So we've been here since 2012 now. So quite a few years now.
So is it right to say, when you're in Boise, all the news media and stuff, I mean, Boise is one of the fastest growing in the United States. When you're actually living it day to day, do you experience it that way? Does it feel like a huge influx of people have come in?
Yes, it does. It does. But it's lovely. It's a nice place to be. We're half an hour from the mountains, half an hour from the rivers, half an hour. I mean, the airport is easy to get in and out of. We have a lot of folks moving here from Texas, California, Oregon, Washington, the East Coast. It's a great place to live. And so I don't begrudge any of them for that, but we definitely feel the growth happening.
Cool. All right. Yeah, I just didn't know if it was actually what it appeared to be, and because I hear it all the time. So cool. That focus on my background, I worked in mental health for a long time. I was a police officer. And so I have a lot of fascination with human psychology as well. Grew up single parent in poverty, et cetera. So I've really been akin to that for a long time. Where does your kind of passion for that human psychology come from? What do you attribute that to?
Oh, I love that question. That's so thoughtful. My high school psychology teacher, Mr. Shomek. I went to high school in Wheaton, Illinois, and I was blessed with a wonderful opportunity to learn from somebody who was very, very passionate I loved it. I fell in love with the psychology of why people do things, the ego, the id,
Mm.
the ego protecting our inner child, um, wearing that armor on the outside to protect the child on the inside. And it was just I was blessed, like I said, with a very good experience with the public school system. Not everybody gets that experience. And for me, I had an American government teacher. I had speech and debate teachers. I had psychology teachers, but I found the communication aspects, those things are all very fascinating to me and where I felt the most passionate. So I think that's kind of where it started. And then I had my first kind of um, experience right after high school going into a direct sales role, doing face to face sales. Um, it was very hard. Hearing no a lot. It was very hard, but I learned how to apply some of the human psychology things, and I learned, not just vocal cues, not just facial cues, but just to know the communication patterns and apply that, and not in a manipulative way, but in a genuine human interaction way. And I've always really enjoyed that. Um, and that feeling of being able to just enter into a meaningful conversation with a complete stranger, um, if you're saying the right things in the right way that are disarming but not manipulative, they are charming but not overbearing, and it allows for true human interaction. And that's what I've really enjoyed, I think, the most in my career and in my professional life is the interaction, that we get with people like you, Matt. Hearing about your childhood or hearing about your past life in law enforcement, that's fascinating. So I'm sure that those things formulate the way that you ask questions, and that I find to be really fascinating.
Yeah, because when we think about a negotiation, we do want to be considerate of what the other side is feeling, right? Not only what they're valuing, but how they might even be perceiving what you're saying,
Right.
right? Because at the end of the day, the negotiation is about a win-win strategy, right? We want to both walk away well with that. So you do strike me as somebody who would be really adept at reading between the lines, like you pointed out, facial cues and voice tone, et cetera, et cetera. Do you find those skills useful when you are negotiating, and or do you get the opportunity to utilize them frequently?
Mm. Yes, I think the opportunity, there's a little bit of science and there's a little bit of art there to that, right? I think that I do get that opportunity, working in sales, as the chief revenue officer in my current role, and um, in a software company, having the opportunity to work and negotiate and work with a variety of different stakeholders. I definitely think that the visual, the social cues, and some of those things come with it. But I also think there's like a business psychology layer. Who am I talking to? What do they care about? If I'm talking to somebody in procurement, they're X's and O's, right? They don't care as much about the sentimental value, the feelings of it. If I'm talking to someone in marketing, the words I'm going to use are completely different. It's a little bit flowery. The language is a little bit more soft. If you're talking to someone in sales, sharper, a little bit more pointed. Blunt instruments are good, right? Um, so I think, yes, I think to answer the question, I think it helps. I think I use it. But I think what I've learned as I've, hopefully grown and matured as a leader is it's situational,
Mm.
if that makes sense.
So being adaptable, kind of like being able to apply a different modality or strategy based on who your audience and who you're working with. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think I look at people that are like my sales heroes, or that are people that I would say are great negotiators based on, the content and the things I read, like Chris Voss, Never Split the Difference, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And the people that kind of revolve around those spheres of influence. I think like a big trend right now on LinkedIn, for example, is you'll look at how top sellers talk about how they sell to the C-suite versus to the director level versus to entry level. And for a lot of sales professionals that are just learning, I think those are important things. But I think it actually goes a little bit further. I think knowing someone's background, knowing someone's what they care about, um, there's the psychology that applies to everybody, and then there's the intimate details about, it's that relational component of negotiation, knowing who you are, knowing what you care about, knowing what your values are, really, I think, influence those situational negotiations as well.
There's been a big trend lately speaking about values, like you talked about. You strike me, David, as somebody who's very intuitive, very humble. Would you say that those are fair descriptors of you?
I would say I'm the most humble. Yeah,
You, I
absolutely.
am the best humble person ever. you know, and so what we talk about a lot on my team is that you want to be have a collaborative approach, right? It's not about winning. It's not about beating the other person. You want to have a collaborative approach, and of course, the negotiation begins with the very first email or phone call, the tone that's set. Has there ever been, when you look back at all the negotiations that you've had, have you ever, I can tell you I have you ever stepped outside the lines of that and maybe you're having a bad day or something and you are a bit more aggressive? Have you seen your results of the negotiations
Hmm.
go down directly correlated to the amount of humanity and humility that you portray?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Um,
On purpose,
yeah,
sir.
yeah. No, I appreciate it. Yes, I have, and I think one of the greatest things that I've learned personally, and I couldn't agree with you more. It's not about winning or losing. It's about um, making everyone feel like they've won. It's about making everyone feel like we're coming away with. Um, and what's really interesting is I start a lot of calls. As someone who's still working and helping in a sales performing role with my teams over the past few years, I've closed anywhere between, I think it's probably right around like 1.8 to $2 million worth of business.
Wow.
Um, just me personally,
Mm-hmm.
what I've learned from that is that when I'm patient and when I lead with, hey, what's the value you're looking to get from this call? I'm a lot more likely to understand how I need to communicate my value so that it's actually received well, right? So that the uptake is there. So I think, yeah, I've absolutely seen those situations where, especially when I'm having a bad day, or especially when I'm frustrated, or I'm just trying to blunt instrument the wrong people.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, the value of what I have to say goes down, and of course, the value of my results goes down. Um, and that's something I had to learn through failure. And
Mm-hmm.
just and so I was fortunate to have some good coaches who helped me and pointed that out to me. But I definitely often choose to do things the hard way, and it's something that I regularly tease my sales manager about. Is like, hey, you don't have to do this the hardest way possible. Please allow me to ease some of your frustrations, your suffering with my past mistakes. Let me tell you how I failed brilliantly, extravagantly in a blazing ball of fire. Let me tell you how I failed in this way. And so I think, yeah, what I've really come to notice, Matt, is that value piece allows people to feel seen and heard. And when they feel seen and heard, and not only feel it, but I can mirror that back to them and show them that I see them, I hear them, and maybe I can't understand their perspective, but I can empathize with it. Yeah, that's frustrating when X, Y, and Z. Okay, so let's talk through this. Let's talk about our options. Um, it definitely helps, right? We all want to feel seen and heard, and I definitely think that when I do too much blunt instrument or go too aggressive, I definitely think that the goals are harder to obtain. They're harder to hit our numbers. They're harder to get to the quote unquote win in that negotiation.
Well, great call out there because I mean it's amazing. Even if you go to the bank and you're at the teller, and when you're done that interaction, listening to that person for 10 seconds, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or even saying like, "Hey, like I really enjoyed talking with you today. We think it's so little, but in today's world, that happens so infrequently, where actually you get listened to for an entire sentence. Everybody's interrupting you because they're waiting, right? And so, to your point, it's amazing what you can accomplish when you're in an interaction with somebody, whether it's business or personal,
Yeah.
and you let them know that you're hearing them and that you care about what they have to say. People really, really respond to that well, and you think it's not that big of a deal, but it is. So I really respect that call out. You have an interest in human psychology. I do too. So I want to talk for a minute about, let's talk about ego. You used that word earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk about ego in negotiations. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on, we talked about the ego protecting the child inside, the fears, the insecurities.
Yeah.
And people go into a negotiation sometimes with fears of being uncomfortable, fears of anger, failure, blah, blah, blah. So, to narrow that question down a bit, I'd love to hear your thoughts on, do you think that ego has a place in negotiations,
Mm.
either as a positive way or negative, and kind of where you think it comes from?
Yeah, that's a great question. Wow. Yeah, so I think let's start with like the ego, my belief on what the ego is in a positive sense in a negotiation. An ego can protect us from hurtful, terrible, mean, nasty things that happen in some negotiations, right? And I think it's funny because a lot of the time the the more challenging negotiations happen with our family members or with people that we care about, because obviously familiarity breeds resentment, right? Um,
Sure.
it's a human phenomenon, right? But I think in the sense of like a business negotiation, for example, the ego can be a positive tool in that we can use that as our armor. And there's a difference between being, the kind of like boiler room swagger, top salesman, very cocky, I'm going to close the deal no matter what ego, versus an ego that we have that's healthy, that is in check, that is not running the narrative, but it's there as our armor, as kind of that exterior, that rough exterior. When somebody says, something that's harsh, or overly harsh, especially, that we can allow that to roll off our back. And I think what's really interesting, I think a lot of people who maybe don't have really great coaching or haven't been trained on negotiation, or haven't spent time, really reading through it and building the mental muscles for it, they think they need to show up with this really coarse, rough exterior in order to be a successful negotiator. Some of the nicest people I've ever met are some of the most difficult and toughest negotiators. And I
Sure.
don't think that's a coincidence. Um, and so I think that for some people, they think, and this is my opinion, I think the misconception is I've got to show up and be kind of an asshole um, in order to get my way. And there's a lot of jokes and a lot of different directions we could go with that. But I think as it relates to, the positive aspects of it, I think if it's healthy, if it's fed well, if it's educated and we're balanced, that our ego can actually help protect that inner child, our feelings, as we show up to that negotiation. For me, where that comes from is my parents, my dad. It comes from Brady, our CEO. He's always really good about it's kind of funny. He'll give me time to be like, feel my feelings. He'll be like, how do you feel about that? I'm like, I don't want to talk about that right now. I'm feeling frustrated right now, or I'm feeling passionate right now. He's like, well, let's just, it's okay. Let's just pump the brakes. So it's just kind of funny. But I think where
Love
it
that.
comes from for everybody is our childhood, really. I think that, everybody has their different suitcases, their different backpacks, their overnight bags, their baggage that they bring with them into a job, especially a leadership job. And even more so when we're going to be doing negotiation, contract, sales, hiring, firing, mergers and acquisitions, any of these types of negotiations. We bring all of these things from the playground, from, elementary school, middle school, when we have all of our fears that are living there. So I think for a lot of people, the negative can be, I don't want anybody to see my insecurities and where I might not be good enough. And I think for a lot of other people, the understanding of the balance enables them to be an excellent communicator, understanding that, hey, Sometimes my feelings are probably going to get hurt. Sometimes I'm probably going to look like an idiot. Sometimes I'm going to put my foot in my mouth. For me, that happens more often than
I
not.
say for me, that's more often than not, but yeah.
But so where does it come from? I think it's a childhood thing, and I love Brene Brown. I love reading on how the emotions and the feelings of our heart affect not just the ego, but also the other aspects that make up um, our psychosocial personalities. And so that's my just kind of rough, very sophomoric interpretation of it for myself. But I certainly think some of the best negotiators I've ever met. Again, I just don't think it's a coincidence that they're some of the nicest people I've ever met. And that doesn't make them pushovers by any stretch of the imagination. And I would also say it's a lifelong goal of mine to be in that category of being as nice as some of those guys, because I still struggle with that, because again, it's one thing to say, oh, I'm going to show up and be this balanced person. And it's another thing, to not fall into that habit of like putting on that protective armor, because sometimes these negotiations can feel personal.
It's such a stereotype, isn't it? That like that nice people or collaborative people are weaker people, and the more aggressive, outspoken, kind of alpha, you might call it, like that those people are stronger. And in fact, the funny thing, and I agree with you, David, is that it usually tends to be the opposite of that, right? I mean, a lot of times the people who are kind of the most secure with who they are don't feel that need to do that. And so, yeah, I mean, in the world of negotiations, there's a movie. There's a movie correlation, if you will, but that strong negotiators are pounding fists on tables and very confrontational. But that actually doesn't show the best outcomes. And so, you know, going to your point a little bit, it's we care about the end result of the negotiation, right? It's
Sure.
the end result. This drama getting there doesn't have to be there for that. So, is that something that you have actually seen? So that's your approach to negotiations, an approach, by the way, that I agree with. But in the negotiation that you've had, have you seen that the other party is typically in line with those feelings as well, or do you typically experience the other party to be a bit more on, call it, the movie side of aggression?
I would say it depends. And again, it's going to be who we're talking to. I would also say I negotiate differently when I'm negotiating with other C-suite. If I'm talking to our COO and our CEO and we're having a passionate debate, fire, fire meets fire, steel meets steel. Sometimes that's the way that you really have to have fierce conversations when you believe in something. But I would also point out that that's structured in a safe way where those are the rules of engagement and people understand, hey, we're going to have fierce conversations. So I would say what's really interesting is I'm seeing more and more in external negotiations, negotiations that maybe aren't happening within my corporate structure, my sphere of influence necessarily, but with prospects, customers. There's more of a willingness to say what the rules of engagement are. There's more of a willingness up front to say like, hey, how are we going to do this negotiation? How are we going to have this conversation? And what I found personally is if we focus on values, hey, what value are you looking for? What's most important to you? How would you like to discuss this? Asking permission. Is it okay? Is it okay if I show your entire team our pricing structure? Is it okay if I show your entire team our proposal? Is that not okay? Do you want control of that? I think negotiating the terms, I guess, of the negotiation, for lack of a better way of
Mhm.
explaining it, I think that's been especially prevalent in B2B sales, at least what I've seen in the past 3 or 4 years, because I think there's a kind of a migration away from the hammer and tongs, like pounding of fists on the desk and coffees for closers, and like I don't I just think
Yeah,
that's
yeah, yeah.
it's hopefully the old ways are dying, but I think
Glenn Gary, Glenn Ross, right?
that's right, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Oh, ABC, always be closing. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, I think again, it really it depends on what type of negotiation we're having. I mean, a negotiation with my 12-year-old, um, It's going to be a lot softer. It's going to be a lot more like making sure that my 12-year-old feels safe, heard, seen, understood, and then guided to making the right decision so that we're learning. And I think in a lot of ways, it's kind of the same with internal negotiations with our team members, because if we don't do it that way, they're not learning.
Hmm.
If it's just no or just yes, but we don't start with why, Seneca, if we don't, lean into that, start with why, and then frame why we're negotiating this. Here's what we're negotiating. Here's what my reason is for negotiating this with you. Now let me hand you a decision that you can make. Um, and, I think that can feel like that old school hammer and tongs, yes, no, very micromanagey. But I do also think it's a fine line between kid gloving it, with our team members and with negotiations, and, being able to say what we need to say without, you know, um, without being fire and brimstone, with just being able to be direct, be straight to the point. And I think a lot of that, again, if we're talking science and art,
Yeah,
I think that's the art of communication, but I think there's definitely a science of how you talk to people, what their title is, what their role is, where they are in the company, how big the company is. If I'm talking to a director of marketing at a company with 1,000 employees, that's very different from talking to a director of marketing at a company with 20 employees.
absolutely.
And that's just hard for a lot of people to recognize. And you need a lot of at bats and a lot of repetitions in order to have that mental playbook and know where to go in those conversations. And I truly think that the only way you get really, really good at that discernment thing is you're either born with it or you just do hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of those conversations. So,
It's funny because you touched on, I think, a really important topic, which is going in kind of like prepared, right? Like
mhm.
having a game plan of what communication strategy you may use with each person depending on what you perceive them to be and what they value. So I love that call out that you talk about, different people are going to require different types of communication. You also talked about art and science, and that's one of my favorite topics in this whole podcast that I love to hear. So you touched on this a little bit, but if you had to choose, call it 51% or 49%, or maybe a bigger margin, where do you think a negotiation falls heavier on? Is it the art or is it the science? Don't say 50-50. You're not allowed to say 50-50.
Yeah, that's a cop out. I'm with you there.
Yeah,
So I actually also I would say there's some really strong parallels to sales and sales professionals here. I would say,
agreed. Agreed.
yeah. So I personally think it's 60-40. I think it's 60% science. I think it's 40% art. And the reason I believe that is just from my own experience of seeing top performing sales professionals. Top performing sales professionals are very good at innately um, just naturally following a sales process, and they're naturally good at, and whether it's learned or not, they are able to follow a process, whether it's medic or spiced or whatever, um, the challenger sale, spin selling, whatever your method is that works for your company. um, what I have personally seen is the sales professionals who are able to follow a process and that do things in a lather, rinse, repeat way, but they know the art, that 40% of it is who's in front of me. How am I talking to Matt versus how am I talking to Valerie versus how am I talking to Mary or Sean or Ryan? And what are their titles? What is their role with their company? What do they care about? Again, they've got different needs, different values, different perspectives. Um, and so I think that's where the science comes in of simply saying things like, here's our approved pricing. You talk about preparation when you're presenting something. Hey, here's what we've gotten approved for you.
Hmm.
It's already approved. This sets the stage that, hey, our management, our leadership team, this is the deal that, yep, exactly. We signed
Yep.
off on it. Things like that, I think, having that prepared, that's scientific, that's process oriented. And we have found personally, in my current role, that when we do things like that, not only, of course, does it make it easier to measure, easier to coach to, but then much like agriculture. So talking about my experience in agriculture, my experience with aquaponic and aeroponic farming systems where you're using water, and what I learned from doing that and from bringing really high quality gourmet produce to chefs, it was oftentimes one small change that would take a product like a really, really special microgreen or something that you would find as a garnish, or just some weird, produce that somebody gets really excited about for 3 months in a seasonal menu. It's just changing one thing at a time.
Hmm.
Don't change three, don't change four, because if you change two or more, you aren't going to know which one actually made the difference. Now, of course, there's glaring holes in every sales process and at any negotiation process that's not working correctly. And you could say, well, we obviously need to fix the leaks in the bucket. I get that, but for most things, I equate it to like this growing system. I couldn't figure out why my fish weren't growing well in this system. And if you don't know a lot about aquaponics, what you do is you put fish in the system, you feed the fish, then their waste feeds the plants. It's a single input system. It's just the fish food. I couldn't figure out why my fish weren't thriving. It was simply because the pH in the water was literally 0.1% off of what it was supposed to be. I
Good
was
example.
measuring it in one place, but I wasn't measuring it in the other places in my system. In the other places in my system, the variance was just enough that it was causing problems. And so I think the science aspect of negotiating, the science aspect of sales, I believe that negotiation is a lot about sales, um, is just being able to measure that one thing.
Hmm.
Measure that one thing, change something, measure it. Maybe you have a hypothesis, but if you can't do that, then you're going to struggle. So I believe that it's a lot more science, majority science, but there's that very strong art component. And to tie it all back in, Matt, I think the best sales professionals I've ever seen, I'll use like Mark Roberger, for example, former CRO of HubSpot. Mark is brilliant. I love watching him talk. I love listening to him. I've had the pleasure of seeing him at Gong.io conference in San Francisco a few years back. I've read his book, The Sales Acceleration Formula, killer book. He's got this formulaic approach that they came up with at HubSpot for how they were going to hire salespeople. It's attributes. It lists out which ones you rank them out, which ones are most
Hmm.
important. Is it creativity, intelligence, right? So
Yep.
I love that approach. And that's, how I look at things is like, hey, it's all formulaic, right? So, we've kind of done that here in my current role. I've done that here. We've got a formula, not just in our salespeople, but in everybody that we hire. What are the personality attributes? What are the skill attributes? How do we rank them? So that's my thought. I don't know how that resonates with you or the majority of your guests, if they say it's more science, more art, or I'm sure everybody's got a little bit different perspective, but
I've heard everything. I've never heard a 90%, but I've heard an
wow.
85%
Wow.
one way or the other. But that's true, David, because when you think about Glenn Ross, for example, there's that scene where Al Pacino is with his prospect sitting at dinner, and they're having like this intense psychological moment where like Al Pacino's trying to look into his eyes to discover if he's going to do it. And I think that that's an evolution away from that. I think that we've evolved, whereas to your point, with the fish, with the single input system with the fish, right? It was 1.1, right? Point
Yeah.
0.1 variable
Right.
that changed the whole thing. And
Mm-hmm.
so much like a sales or negotiation process, it is great to set up a system that you've tested not only at the top where the pH is fine,
Right.
but also in the middle as you go
In the
through,
bottom.
right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so to make sure that it's homogeneously
Right.
good, so it's good so I love that you talk about that. I agree with you. um I our team of experts, we tend to be, generally speaking, in that 70-30% range as
Mm-hmm.
well. Varying opinions there, but 70% of it being more of a science, especially in 2023, where we're moving into a lot more of AI assisted things, et cetera. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, we are fully in agreement there. Carrying on with that topic of emotions,
Mm-hmm.
it's certainly good that people are passionate about things, right? Like you talked about heading into some of those meetings where the guardrails are on and we like, okay, we're passionate about this. This is going to be an intense conversation, but it's within the bounds agreed upon.
Mm-hmm.
What have you seen in your own experience happen when people are using emotions in negotiation? Like, do you prefer the people you're negotiating with and on your team to be more sterile and robotic, or do you actually like them to have some fire and passion?
Oh man, 1,000% fire and passion over
Yeah.
sterile and robotic, because again, I think human connection is, gosh, I think it's a necessity. We all crave it, whether we're willing to admit it to ourselves or not, right? And a Zoom meeting, which is what most of our negotiations today are, um, it can be difficult to get that real raw human emotion and that real connection. I mean, people talk about their dog or their cat or their kids or what they did over the weekend, but it can be difficult. And sometimes I think just literally recognizing it and asking for it and offering it, um, I think that can open the doors. And I think, when we're hiring people, and when I'm hiring people, that's really what I'm looking for, is people that really are willing to expose themselves in that way and be vulnerable. Um, it is definitely, you definitely have to be willing to have it go sideways. You have to be willing to hear some hurtful things. You have to be willing to, but I think when you do that, I think the reciprocity is there, right? The people on the other side of the conversation are a lot more likely to let their guard down a little bit and be like, okay, you went first. I guess I'll expose some of my worries here a little bit as well. And again, edifying that process, right? Hey, this is nothing new, Matt. We hear this all the time. Don't worry, your concerns are totally valid. We've heard lots of companies that have that problem or that concern. Here's what we have by way of dealing with this. Let me know, how does this sound to you? Does this resonate, or what can I do to make sure that you're feeling confident about this? I think the more we shy away from that honesty, the harder it is to get to an honest result. And so I think that that's really what we're looking for with our team is the passion, the ability to be fearless communicators.
Yeah, because not only are you building that trust and rapport, but it all circles back, right? Because if you build that trust and rapport, you show that vulnerability, you show that authenticity, which I think is probably the number one thing that most humans are craving right now, but aren't getting. I think we're all scratching and clawing to find that in some ways. But I think if you do show that authenticity, not only are you building that trust, but what do we know happens when you build trust? You have better outcomes, right? So, what a great advantage it is that when you are a human being, when you are authentic, when you are raw, you also do your job better. You get the things you want more. Like it's a great combination. Drop the BS and just kind of be yourself. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. And I also think, if there's no fear, and I think this is one of the most important things, Matt, for me as a leader, I hate retroactive accountability. I refuse it when somebody tries to push it on one of my team members, or when I do it to somebody, they have permission to call it out. But that feeling of like, well, that wasn't good enough and we're going to move the goalposts, or you should have known better. Well, how should they have known better? Or, you know, and I think we think about that with our internal team, but we don't think about that as often with negotiating. And so if we're not doing a good job of clarifying what the ground rules are, or clarifying what those guardrails are for the negotiation, or the clarification around what's important to you, or how do you want to negotiate this? How do you want to do this? How do you want to have this contract process work? I think that's a question that a lot of sales professionals are afraid to ask, for good reason, because maybe they don't have the process behind them to back it up. And, there's some systemic, process issues there, but hopefully that's something that you guys would be able to help with. But I think that's something that needs to kind of bubble up in the negotiation process.
So you mean you're not into people suffering consequences for something they knew nothing about? That doesn't seem odd to you at all. Wow. I mean, that's I can't tell you the amount of times everywhere in life, I think we all experience it, but people have a really hard time grasping the inequity of a situation. Like people shouldn't be suffering consequences if they weren't aware of the rules of the game, right? So to speak.
Yeah.
And so I love that you're calling that out about, like, let's communicate openly ahead of time what's happening, what's going on, because I don't want to go away. I don't want to go to bed that night feeling like I imparted punishment or
Mm.
detriment to somebody that they knew
Mhm.
they had no opportunity to fix.
And if you think about deals that we lose, negotiations that we lose, quote unquote, that we thought we were going to win, that we were like, oh man, this one, and we don't. And then we can't figure out why. Well, that's why. It's because we didn't have upfront what's most important to you, Matt, in this negotiation. What you and that's something that I've really had to learn the hard way. Just full disclosure, through failure, I had to learn if I don't ask upfront, hey, what's the decision criteria coming down to for you and your organization? Instead of assuming, and it takes a little bit of fearlessness, especially in larger deals and larger negotiations, to really ask some of those things. Hey, let's get down to brass tacks. What's the most important part of this for you? What do I need to ensure happens in order for you to feel satisfied, to feel comfortable, to feel secure with this transaction, whatever it may be. So I think I had to learn that the hard way through failure, but I know that there's a big push now to help people learn through doing it the right way rather than through failing the wrong way.
Well, and before we wrap up here, and I want to hear some of your final thoughts, but like that's exactly right because it actually works both ways. Because when we get into a negotiation, does it benefit me if I know what you want at the end? Yes, it does.
Yeah.
But does it benefit you if I know what yes, it does. And so the question actually works both ways because,
Right.
David, when I ask you, what is it that's most important to you? Like, how can I help you achieve that? Am I doing it to help myself? Yes. But am I doing it to help you too? Yes. It's for
Right.
both of us, right? We both need to communicate what we need so that we both, if we have that trust, are in a spirit of helping each other do that. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think like there's obviously some limitations to that. Like I could think of like law practices and certain businesses where you may not want to give up what is most important to you. I can certainly understand that, but in this context, for me, thinking of like B2B negotiations, I
Mhm.
think it's a great way for everybody to feel like they're quote unquote winning. And if everybody's winning, there are no losers, and that's a pretty solid negotiation, I think.
I would agree. Okay, so to wrap us up here, I want to hear a bit about kind of the projects that you have going on right now, whether that was just one. So it looks like I'm on the website here, iCapture.com. I think I know what your product is because I think I've used this, but I'm not going to embarrass myself and sound like an idiot. So I'm going to ask you to chat a bit about what's happening with you and your team over at iCapture, kind of what your value proposition is, how you guys differentiate yourselves, et cetera.
Yeah, absolutely. So here at iCapture, we help companies capture trade show leads and
Okay.
turn them into revenue.
Okay.
And that's a big deal for companies that do a lot of trade shows and events. We have hundreds of customers, from companies that are Fortune 50, Fortune 100, down to the smallest software companies, small startups. But the one thing that they all have in common is they value conversations, and they want to figure out how they can capture conversations at an event and get that into Salesforce or HubSpot. Um, we have been very blessed. We're a privately held, profitable company. We didn't just survive through the pandemic. We were able to come out the other side still growing, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, for a company in the event space was really, really, really hard.
Sure.
And not without pain. I will certainly say that.
Of course.
But we've focused, and the big thing that we're working on right now is just continuing to solidify our our thought leadership in this space. We are the number one trade show lead capture solution in the world. Our ratings on G2 are really solid, and what's really great is I see a lot of those shout outs for our team and not just the product. And that really kind of comes back to what we've been talking about, starting with why, negotiating, those value statements. We have a very, very high percentage of customers that renew on our product year over year. And we wouldn't be where we are if it wasn't for them giving us the great feedback that they give us, helping us to improve our platform. but ultimately, it's a lot of fun because we get to help these companies really focus on capturing this conversation data from a live experience and get that back into the CRM and turn that into weaponized data that their sales team can deploy. And so I live for that because I love the automation. I'm a huge SaaS software nerd, obviously. So it's a really exciting time in MarTech right now as companies are starting to go omni-channel instead of just kind of segmenting things and saying, okay, this channel does this. Okay, Tim, you're in charge of that channel, and Lisa, you got that channel. No, it's all omni-channel now. So that's even more exciting because, if you're a big picture thinker, then you get to kind of see the strings and how they all kind of tie together and how it all moves. So it's an exciting time.
Agreed. And I will say that as somebody who has been to trade shows, both doing the old fashioned business card exchange as well as using a capture feature like this, it was literally night and day. Like
Yeah.
I would never do another trade show again without that, and in full transparency, the program that we had used at the time didn't even have the integration with HubSpot and Salesforce. So had I known about iCapture at the time or any future we're going to do, I'm telling you right now on camera, like we're going to use you. I mean, that's just a no brainer. It's so easy to scan. It's scanning with your phone, right, David? Is that how it
Yep.
goes?
Yep.
Yeah.
It's just
So,
an app, goes anywhere in the world, online,
yep.
offline. Yep. You got it.
I mean, it was like butter. So, in any event, David, it's been a true, true, true pleasure to have you here. Genuinely. Do you have any closing thoughts or anything else that you want to add?
I just appreciate the questions and the contemplative nature. It's always a pleasure to talk about, not just human psychology, but the sales profession. Looking at how really there's been an appetite for, I think, not just polishing the sales profession, but really edifying and recognizing the great work that sales professionals do. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the sales profession in general and really edify that and the great work that these folks do.
That's a great call out. One more question before I let you go. I
Sure.
won't put you on the spot. Maybe the answer to this is no, but any chance that iCapture is going to look at the possibility of being at SaaStr next month? Is that on the radar or not for this year? Maybe next.
There are team members that might be there for sure, but no, we're not going to have like a physical presence at that event. We get, so that's like our busiest time of year. So
Ah,
for us, it's kind of like an all hands on deck. Like, got to ramp up and be ready for Q1.
got it. Well, we might stop out there. We'll bring some of your stuff for you anyway. So,
Oh, groovy! Yeah, love to see you there.
all right, David, thank you so much. And we will talk to you again soon.